My name is Claudia Green, and this is She Did That, the podcast shining a spotlight on remarkable women who are breaking barriers and proving that greatness knows no gender. From female founders who have raised millions of pounds, the investors changing the landscape as we know it, to survivors of tragedy who have achieved the amazing and many more. We will share the stories of these incredible women who will inspire and empower you. In order to support us and these women, please subscribe on your viewing or listening channel of choice so we can continue our mission of sharing the stories that should and need to be heard. Today, I have an amazing woman who is going to share her story of surviving one of the world's largest cults and how she turned her trauma into passion. She is an author, a mental health advocate and expert, and trained psychotherapist. I'm very pleased to introduce Petra Velzeboer. Thank you so much for being here, Petra. I'm really excited to talk to you about your experiences.
I'm excited to be here.
So usually I start with the same question for everyone, which is about their background. Yours is quite unique. You grew up in the Children of God cult. But before we sort of dive into that, I just want to get a background on your life. So what it was like growing up, where you grew up, and how many siblings you had, the normal stuff.
Sure, if we could call it normal. I guess there were some normal bits. So I'm one of five. Mm-hmm. We're a step family. So mm-hmm. I'm the only kind of blonde one. Mm-hmm. And I've got two brunette siblings. My dad's African American. So mm-hmm. we've got like all the colors of Benetton represented. I think I was 8 when I realized that my brother, who's black, wasn't my twin, and realized that that wasn't a thing and you couldn't be twins if you weren't blood related. Anyway, complicated. And so I grew up in, like, when people hear the word cult, they immediately think like, you know, the darkest stories that kind of hit Netflix. There's a documentary out at the moment. You know, we think about mass suicides and, you know, just the most horrific things.
Yeah.
But of course, when you live in community, if I said I grew up in a commune, yeah. people actually lean in these days and go, ooh, what was that like? And, you know, they're sort of intrigued and interested because we're really lonely these days and isolated in society. So I grew up with, you know, maybe 80 to 100 people at a time. It was really big. So there ended up being about 10,000 people spread out all over the world in different communes. So it wasn't just one commune. It was kind of mission driven. And, you know, I grew up in India, Brazil, Russia, Kenya, all over Europe, you know, quite nomadic, moving around. And we had lots of music. There was structure. So you kind of felt safe in a strange way. And it was only later on that you sort of realize, oh, other people go to school. Like for us, we didn't go to school. We were taught that the world was going to end. And it was usually every 3 years or so, which was very random. And then God would change his mind. It had a religious kind of connotation. So there's this it takes time to realize that whatever your experience, there's usually this good, bad, and this gray area in the middle. And so it took me a little while to figure some of that out. But as I became a teenager and I start looking around, I'm like, oh, this is, you know, people are saying this is a cult. And I guess what that means is there's a leader and everyone follows what they say. And they're supposedly the voice of God or a prophet or something that's bigger than, you know, an individual leader, right? And so, of course, as long as you played by the rules, you were cool. Everything was great.
And if you didn't?
And if you didn't, that's when, you know, I sometimes say people were disappeared. It sounds like it sounds like...
That's like unalived.
But they were maybe excommunicated, kicked out, or put in isolation and, you know, prayed over, just punished, made an example of. You know, I remember close friends of mine, because they'd, you know, done something that was seen as, you know, inappropriate, would have to wear a big sign on them that said, I'm on silence restriction. That meant they weren't allowed to talk for like a month sometimes, right? And so these are your peers, you know, and so talk about, I guess, coercive control and realizing early on that you got to play by the rules in order to survive. And of course, I know we're going to get into it, but I've seen some similarities in founder life, in cult life, in corporate life, in the workplace as well.
Oh, I can believe it.
Which is like incredible to me, because I thought once I left that I would be free and everyone was free, and they certainly aren't.
But you're right though. A lot when people hear the word cult, they think about
Netflix. I mean, I am a Netflix junkie when it comes to like cult programs. So I've seen those kind of things. I think the last one I watched, he ended up setting fire to the whole place. And
sounds about right.
Like a good portion of people perished. So I think that's what people immediately think. But you're right, there are so many people part of it, so everyone's got an entirely different experience. When did your parents join the cult?
So my mom actually joined when she was 17. So really young. I mean, the cult started in the 70s, and I think it was late 70s, early 80s late 70s that she would have joined. My stepdad was a little bit older. He's from the US. My biological father is Australian Norwegian. So, they believed in free love, and there was like lots of, hippie liberation going on that a lot of cults and sort of groups kind of sprung up at that time, because it was the whole counterculture of rebelling against the 50s, 60s, like society work in a particular way, and, LSD, and people were kind of liberated. And so that meant there were a lot of, over time, single parents and kids from all different dads, and, but the whole premise was like we were one family. We were one, like all kids belonged to everybody. And so while that sounds kind of utopian, it actually felt quite insecure for lots of people. Yeah. And of course, once people left, they might be a single parent with 8 kids and not have the structure and the backup, and suddenly need to absolutely struggle in the real world.
But it sounds a lot like the leaders of these cults are preying on quite vulnerable people who need extra support, because you do wonder how that happens. How do you, I think the one I watched last time on Netflix, the guy gave all of his earnings to the cult leader.
Oh, that happens
every
all
penny.
The time. Yeah.
I thought, how does someone convince a guy to part with their earnings?
Well, I think there's this, I think it's a misconception that everybody who joins a cult is a bit like deranged or weak or vulnerable or in this kind of, place where they can be preyed upon. And I know they are preyed upon, so to speak, but you'll see highly educated people, people who are sick of, the system, people who want a mission, people who want to belong. And if we see now, like, what do we do? What price do we pay for the sake of belonging to something, right? And you can go through history, through some of the wars and some of the big things as well, right? I need to belong. I need to stay safe. And so I can be convinced of pretty much anything if it's on that kind of premise.
And how old were you when you it started to click that something maybe wasn't quite right?
So I think probably when I was 14, 15, 16 was me kind of questioning things. Some of my siblings started to leave, or some of my peers started to leave. But I actually look back and kind of think, I used to judge myself even for not being brave enough to stand up to it and leave. What I ended up doing was actually leading a double life. So on the one hand, I was actually trusted and became a bit of a leader and someone who would help with youth camps and like different sort of things. And on the other hand, I would see my sister who'd already left and started that kind of hedonistic, drugs and alcohol, escapist kind of lifestyle. And I think lots of people can relate to wearing a mask, right? Mm-hmm. Showing up with a certain identity in order to be seen as, successful, whatever, in order to survive. But of course, the cracks begin to show over time. So it's kind of like you get the doubt and the like, ooh, I don't really agree with this behavior, but you don't have any construct. You don't have anywhere to put it, or remember, we didn't go to school as kids. So we never talked about like, who do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do, right? And I know that can be a bit oppressive for people when you're like 8 and it's like, what do you want to be? Yeah. You're at school and you have to figure it out at 14, which is ridiculous, right? But for us, that meant like, I didn't see any other option, right? Until much later. And then for me, like many people, sometimes life happens and has to disrupt us in order to wake us up, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, I was dating my now ex-husband, but I was secretly dating in part of my double life. I say dating, partying. I think there's a difference. And then fell pregnant with my son. And so that sort of disrupted my thinking as far as, well, what do I want for him? What do I do now? And that's when I moved to London.
So you had to essentially sneak out. I'm imagining like a compound here.
So also not quite. People often, one of the questions I often get in keynotes and when I do talks is like, how did you escape? Right. And it feels like it's like, you know, getting a getaway car at midnight and grabbing a bag. The thing is, it wasn't a compound. Like there's no walls around many of these cults, right? People have free will on the surface as far as you can leave anytime you want, you know? But if you do, God will punish you. You might get sick. You might, like, all this categorical list of things to be afraid of will happen. So the prison is in your mind. It's not a wall, and it's not, you can leave anytime you want, but you will be ostracized from everything you ever knew and any bit of support and all the good bits that were kind of interweaved with the bad bits. And so that's sometimes more terrifying. Like, have you seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption?
My favorite.
Classic, right? And the whole movie like gets you to that scene where he escapes, right? Digging the tunnel and the posters and the whole thing, right? And then there's that end scene or close to the end where he comes out of the tunnel of shit and like gets out, right? And the rain's falling and he's looking up and you really get the music and the sense that he is now free, right? And I sometimes wish that that's what it was like. Because if you had this pivotal moment where you were now free, it would be different than what it actually is, which is the walls and the judgment and all the things come with you.
Yeah.
So you leave, but you've brought it all with you, you know? Wherever you go, there you are. Yeah. And that's the real challenge.
And do you think it was, because I think this is a detail that's often skipped, is how your parents feel when one of their children leave, because it's, you know, it all focuses on they need to be shunned. You know, the parents are very angry with them, but in reality, they are essentially losing a child or contact with a child. Was it quite difficult for your parents when you saw your siblings leave?
This is a tricky one that I think we're only now maybe figuring out and asking certain questions. I have seen I think I was lucky in this respect because my mother has always tried to keep in touch. And by the time we left, you know, the rules were not quite as strict. And she always fought for, in her own way, to still keep in touch and to be around. Whereas many others didn't, and maybe now lived in absolutely different countries, had zero guidance or support in order to do anything, and ended up, you know, addicted to substances or doing jobs that, you know, we would put a bit of shame next to, right? Just in order to survive, you know? So my mom says she does not regret joining the cult. Okay. But she does regret some of the impacts that kind of happened to us, like not having education and certain things. For me, they're kind of, it's a big pot rolled into one. But everyone's on their own journey. And, you know, I'm a parent myself and parenting's tough, right? And we all have to rationalize our decisions in some way in order to cope and get through life.
Is she still in the cult?
They're not in the cult. And again, the cult is very different than it was. It's not big communes. I mean, there's lots that happen that kind of change things over the years. She and a few other members of my family are still very much Christian. They're still very much kind of connected to that world, but it's not the same as it was. So she lives a secular life like the rest of us.
It almost would, I'm trying to put myself in that situation, but it's difficult. But you almost want them to say, I was wrong, this was terrible, and I'm sorry, just to give you that level of closure. Particularly, she's probably heard you talk about your story and your trauma and experience of it, and that can't be that easy to hear from her point of view.
I think only she can answer some of those questions. I think closure is interesting. I think it's more about acceptance and channeling experience into building my own life, right? And so rather than, and I spent loads of years stuck in that place, right? Of like, you know, why me and why did they do this? And anger and, you know, being a victim of my past. And now I trust a little bit more that everybody's on their own journey and they did the best they could with what they knew. Yeah. And it's not their job even to give me closure. It's my job to find closure and to move my life forward.
I like that. Is there anything that you look back on now during your time? Because obviously you spent 22 years there. It's all you knew. Is there anything that at the time felt fine and completely normal, and now you look back on and you think, that was definitely not okay?
Oh, so many things. So many things. Like we used to have to write what we called, I haven't talked about this for a while, they called them OHRs, which was an open heart report.
Right.
Which meant, I feel like there was a phase, it was when we were quite a bit younger, where we'd have to write our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, like and I took it very seriously, but they could be used against you. Yeah. So in the moment, it was like, oh, it's 6 o'clock. Like, everybody write their OHR. And it almost felt like everyone was hanging out and like had their notebooks and their pens and whatever, you know. So it just felt like that was normal. And then you'd give them in and yeah. And then all sorts of shit would happen. And I'm like, that was weird. Also, every morning, I guess we would be indoctrinated, because we would spend each morning like reading the kind of pamphlets or letters, what they called them, from the founder, who didn't live with us, who was somewhere mystical and somewhere else, but we would read it as gospel truth. We would have to memorize things as kids to like reinforce belief systems over and over again. And then we were told that was protecting our mind. So we are protecting you from the them out there, because they're always there has to be a shared enemy, right? And in order to do that, we're going to fill your mind with these other things. Now, I've now realized that, yes, we need to check our influences, because if you don't do anything about your mind, hey, your notifications, your news, your everything is going to influence you. But in hindsight, I'm like, holy shit, they were just doing the same thing, but in a different way with their kind of ideas.
And so this question is interesting, because I'm going to connect it later to the business world. But for I know you can't speak for all, but in your opinion, for these cult leaders, do you think they genuinely believe that God appointed them and that they are the chosen one and that they need to pass this message? Or do you think they just lie in bed at night and think, I'm going to make them do this tomorrow for fun?
So I literally had this conversation yesterday, because I spoke to a friend who grew up like me, and we were chatting about it. And we were literally chatting about the founder, and her view was that it was like a 10-year plan of manipulation. And my view is the opposite. I think people believe their own bullshit. And I think, and this is where it connects to work, like a founder, right, is like passionate and has an idea, and people are drawn to it. And over months and years, you know, more and more people, and it's a bigger kind of thing to kind of work on. But internally, they might be like, holy shit, I can't change now. Like, everyone's counting on me to go this way. And the bigger you get, the more you need middle management and HR and processes and all this stuff. And so I think in the same way, it just kind of snowballed. And now we have all these kids. Okay, what does God say we do with kids, right? Well, we educate them ourselves, or we put them in groups and we divide them up, and we do this and we do that, making it up as they go along. And then I do think there's probably, you know, things like narcissism, things, you know, kind of...
you kind of have to be a narcissist to do this.
Well, yeah. So again, I don't think there was a 20-year plan of how to fuck up a generation. I think genuinely the founder, and then when he passed, his wife and her new partner, who I think were more manipulative, if I'm honest, I think they thought, how do we keep this machine running and make money from it? And keep telling people what they need to hear in order to keep moving forward.
I guess it's that, I mean, you know this more than me because of your educational background, which we'll move on to in a second. But I guess it's once you get sort of a bit of a taste of some power, it's quite easy to go off the tracks and to let it consume you and get a little bit out of control. Because I'm sure this guy, when he told like 5 people at his local church that they should follow him and listen to everything he says, probably didn't imagine it was going to be like spanning across the globe with thousands of people.
And it's funny now looking into the real history of the founder, that he was kicked out of the church for sexual offenses.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and he was in the shadow of his mother and needed to kind of prove that he could make a bigger church or a better way, like a mission that was anti-church. So, and that was some of the issues that came up for our generation, was this free love and, you know, the kind of ideology. But really, he was already had red flags around him for those things, none of which I knew until maybe 3 or 4 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So kind of sick, power-driven, genuinely believing that he's led by God. And then, like you say, there's this ripple effect of like, ooh, this feels good. And I mean, he was in hiding for many years, not even on the front line experiencing what we were experiencing. It was like these little middle manager voices that were perpetuating the ideas.
It's always the ones with mum issues. Always. I was watching The Fall with Jamie Dornan the other day.
Yeah.
And obviously prolific serial killer. And I said before the end, I was like, definitely has mum issues. And then obviously, spoiler alert, he does.
It's definitely childhood issues where there's either some abuse or there's a lack of care and love and safety for themselves. So there is like this cycle of abuse that often happens for sure.
And did he ever act on, his previous indiscretions and crimes? Was it basically, can't find a better word, a playground for him to use to play out his sick fantasies as well?
That's probably a good word. Okay. And not only that, it's then incorporating that into the belief system that you're teaching other people to go by. So dangerous and more so for some than others. Remember, we were all over the globe, and if there were certain kind of local leaders that also had kind of a sick kind of mindset or whatever, that was often worse. I grew up with, my stepdad's 6'2", and I felt a measure of safety in a way for that reason, because I had two parents and they were a little bit awake to certain things. But I know my friends who are still deeply getting over or experiencing the trauma of that time.
Yeah, that must be extremely difficult to work through mentally. So can you tell me a bit about how you left? I'm not going to use the word escaped. How you left? What prompted you to make that decision? Was it like one aha moment, or were you thinking about it for months? And kind of what did life look like during that time? You mentioned you were pregnant, so that...
So I think the months before I was pregnant, I was quite lost and confused and still trying to grab on to the rationalization of like, I really loved having a shared mission. I loved being with people. There were so many things that I loved. And interestingly, I now run my business and am mission driven and have channeled some of that into good, I would hope. So there was enough to hook me in, to keep me there, because I would rationalize that if I had a clear mission and which was pure and useful, then people were just a bit stupid and I could rationalize it. But that double life, like I was drinking more, I was getting more and more like, who am I? What is the point? Have we been lied to our whole lives? And so that was kind of building up, I guess, for ages. And then when I got pregnant, I lied about the father for, I think, 2 or 3 months. So they were like, who's the father? Because if they realized that the father was somebody who was not part of the community, I would immediately get 6 months of punishment and a whole thing, even though I was like a leader and had given them so much, time and energy and all of these things.
Like what kind of punishment?
So again, I'm not going to be locked in a basement, people. It's more psychological, right? So no matter what I'd already done, I would be on what they called probation. I would have to reread and memorize like all of the core literature and sort of be ticking off these boxes, basically going through a training camp, as it were, to make sure my mind, to prove myself that I was still worthy, I guess, to stay. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of got forced to be in this crossroads, right? And the crossroads was the father of my son. He said, bless him, I will love him to this day. He said, move to London. Trust me, we'd only been going out for like 3 months and we were probably drunk or high most of that time. You know what I mean? That's not the basis for any healthy relationship. But he said, move in with me. Let's figure this out together, right?
Where did you meet?
We met in London. I was based in Amsterdam. Okay. And then we would meet in there was a whole thing. This is where there were the sneaking out at midnight vibe and the whole stories and cover-ups. We would meet in Italy. We would meet in other places.
That's really exciting.
It was quite exciting. Yeah. But you can only distract yourself for so long, right? Before life catches up with you, you know? Yeah. So he said, move in with me. I stalled for maybe 2 months. I think I ignored him for a while. And, our mindset was that children are a blessing and women can do this alone. So I didn't even factor in maybe the right thing to do would be to be with the father of my child. You know what I mean? But then the crossroads was, okay, I can either do 6 months of this probation bullshit, right? Or I can spend 6 months with him, and I'm still going to have to do the 6 months probation to kind of return, but I would have given it a chance.
And you can like live your best life for like 6 months before.
I didn't know if it was going to be my best life, but it was a different life.
Yeah.
And so that started the ball rolling of being completely separate from it.
Did you get like a specific day where you packed your bags and said goodbye to everyone, or it wasn't quite like that?
Was there, I feel like that's a bit of a movie scene. Like we often think that changes are like have background music and, you know, they generally don't.
And like some crying and hugging and...
No.
Okay.
No, they're usually, and especially if you're scared of change, you don't mark it in a big way. You just kind of tiptoe and you kind of go, ooh, I don't know how this is going to go. Let me leave my options open a little bit. And I was able to rationalize that, you know, maybe it was the right thing to do. We had a lot of like right and wrong. Maybe it was the right thing to do to give the dad a chance. I know my mom wanted me to convert him and be like, okay, you have my blessing. Make sure you work on him so he can then join us too.
Oh, God.
There's that kind of vibe. No pressure, right?
It doesn't sound like he would have done that.
And this is where, if this was a movie, the movie would end with the music and they lived happily ever after.
Right. But no one, I always think that when I watch the end of a movie, I think they're going to be in therapy the rest of their lives.
Yes. Or if it's a rom-com, I'm like, I give it 3 months.
Yeah, 100%. You know, when they've got like the fuck boy and he changes his ways and that's it. It's never it.
No, life, people.
So what did, for you, obviously, you'd gone from kind of releasing and having, I guess, what you thought was fun at the time, drinking and smoking. And then obviously you found yourself pregnant, so you couldn't really do all of those things.
No, so for the first little bit, I was probably just like sleepwalking a little bit and kind of attached to my, you know, child and moving into my he's now my ex-husband, but we did, you know, we spent 13 years together, kind of moving into his bachelor pad with his mate, you know. So it was like 2 guys, a woman and a baby kind of vibe. And, you know, we still tried to party and stuff. So not when I was pregnant, but we now have this little baby. And I guess I just tried to be as normal as possible. And so if you think that if we now decide that the cult is weird, that means everyone else must be normal.
Which
right?
we now know not to be true.
We now know is a terrible fallacy. But at the time I thought, okay, I was really good at observing people.
Yeah.
If you grow up in communes and then I grew up in all these countries, you get really good at being a peacemaker in the middle, knowing when to shut up and observing the tiniest kind of change of mood or energy in a space, right? And so I didn't realize that was a superpower until later. But it also is not a superpower because it can keep you really stuck, right? And so I just adapted my behavior again to a different environment. And that worked for a little while. And I had my daughter and, you know, a little middle-class life. And we ended up moving out and from his bachelor pad and his mate and, you know, had a car and he would go to work. And so on the outside, landed on my feet. This is amazing. On the inside, I was slowly, because people think that the trauma is when you're in the darkness. The trauma comes out when you're out. It does. And if you don't know that, and I've now pushed away like family and any connections from before because I needed to figure out like, how do I think for myself? But if you've never done it in your life properly and you now have no mentors or guides or people, I mean, it's terrifying.
Yeah, you're not used to making decisions on your own. And you also didn't, it sounds like that, you know, abuse comes in very many different forms. But essentially, if you're a child and you don't feel safe, for whatever reason safe or safe to express yourself, then it is always going to catch up with you, that feeling, that lack of...
And then throw in the layer of like feeling lied to or like, oh, the world isn't going to end. Oh, I now have 2 kids and no education. That wasn't the life that I was meant to have. You know, as far as I'm not a natural stay-at-home parent, right? Where was the mission? I was raised to be special and to be like chosen as, you know, an elite generation that was going to save the world. I mean, right? I mean, it sounds crazy saying it, but when that's been your whole like message, the whole narrative, your entire life. And now you're invisible, isolated in London, big city, right? No friends, no connections, and have 2 young kids and a boyfriend who's, you know, quite like, let me choose my words carefully. You know, he sees the world in a very particular straight way, which is you work, you maybe party, you get a mortgage, you retire and you die. It's a little bit linear, right?
Yeah.
And so here I was with all this kind of spirit and nowhere to put it. So the shorter version is, you know, took time, but it's later that I descended into depression, alcohol addiction, just completely spiraling out because I just didn't know who I was or what the point of life was. And it led me to a point where I convinced myself that my own 2 beautiful children would be better off without me.
Oh.
Yeah. So a pretty dark kind of edge to get to.
Yeah.
Not quite knowing where to go from there.
And how long did that spiral last for?
I think these things do a little bit of that,
Yeah,
right?
it's not just like a...
Yeah, and people, again, want the background music of the rock bottom. But
Yeah.
there was a few definitely striking rock bottom moments. But on the outside looking in, you know, if someone's struggling, you're like, this must be the worst rock bottom. Like, is this when they're going to wake up?
Yeah.
And they're not ready.
No.
Right? And so I had moments where, you know, my boyfriend would be like, something's got to change. We can't live like this, blah, blah, blah. We've got to do something. And I wasn't ready. And so it took several kind of crisis points, putting myself in danger, my kids at risk, like different things, to eventually, my son would have been 5 and my daughter 3 when I went to my first AA meeting.
Wow.
Yeah, and began. I mean, before that, I started studying 1 day a week. I started doing a couple things to attempt to fix things, right? But nothing was fixing this. It was just actions on the outside to try and pretend to be normal. And so that's when the real work begins, I guess. Because again, people like it was terrible and now it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's not linear.
No.
And that's the thing. And people have this assumption that it's like, I went through this, I got over it, and now I'm at the other side. The truth is that you, in some way, live with your demons. And once you've been through something like that, or, you know, when you've experienced anxiety or depression, there's always a small part of you that's like, could I go into that again? It's like, it's a fear, I think.
There's a threat for sure.
Yeah, it's scary. So when your son was about 5 and your daughter was 3, that's when you kind of started the journey of healing, would we call it?
Healing's a funny one, because healing implies that we get to a point where we are fully healed, you know? Yeah. It also, to me, has a bit slight religious connotations of like, you are healed, you know, as if it's like that, right?
It'd be nice if it was, but...
I mean, right?
It would be lovely.
Go on a course, I'm healed. I've got a certificate.
Yeah, I know. That would be nice.
But yeah, the journey of healing, I guess, or of learning to live a good life, right? Of mental health, I guess. And that's, of course, an angle I come from now. And it's a slow, people sometimes think like, oh, you just have a 10-year plan or a 5-year plan and this vision of like what healed looks like. You have no clue. You don't even know you're unhealed, right? Or broken or anything like that. I don't like thinking of people as broken, but you don't actually know what the journey is. All you know is the next right step. That's it.
Yeah. And I guess it's also about taking life day by day, because it's a bit scary thinking of it as right now, for the rest of my life, I'm going to be fine. Or I'm not going to touch alcohol. Like, that's a little bit daunting.
It's unrealistic and it doesn't feel real. And I remember in AA, they've got this little card that you can put in your wallet, and it's called the Just for Today card. And there's maybe like 10 bullets, right? And that would be all I would do as far as boosting my mental health. At one point, I'd read it, and it basically said things like, just for today, I will be calm. I will learn something. I will treat each problem as if it's just a problem in today, you know, rather than like everything's terrible, you know. And it just had these little principles that allowed you to right size things and be like, just for today, I'm going to go to bed sober. That's it. That's all I'm going to do.
Yeah, I can change my mind tomorrow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it stacks over time.
Yeah. So what kind of, let's lead into education. So you say you didn't go to school.
I know, right? And now I've got a master's degree.
I know, this is so nuts. What kind of education, were you just homeschooled?
Yeah, so we were homeschooled, but like I never took a science lesson in my life, and
Well, they don't allow that, do they?
And I was never good at math, and I never really which is hilarious because I now run a business, right? But
Me too.
Right, I know, right? But we read from a really young age. We learned to read. We learned a variety of things that would be useful in their minds to the life that we were meant to live. So we were very smart, worldly wise, because we were around lots of different cultures and people, but then really sheltered in other ways, right? So yeah, I've got a master's degree, but never took GCSEs.
That's incredible.
Well, I think there was a weird thing of like, if you don't know what the rules are, you don't actually play by them.
No.
And you realize that you can actually, just skip a few steps. But if you kind of thought, if you knew what all the steps were, you wouldn't realize that you could skip some.
Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
No.
So I guess now in hindsight, that was a superpower for, giving me an edge in business, taking risks, not necessarily following all the rules, but equally to get an education. I lied about GCSEs.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, you'd never be able to do that now.
Don't know. Who's tried recently?
All right, I'm going to try and get into Cambridge next week.
Good luck.
Okay, thank you.
And then I thought, so I did like a level 4 counseling diploma. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, why would I do like a regular degree if I could just skip to do a master's?
Yeah.
Because people only ask you what your last thing was.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, I thought people said, well, that's ridiculous. You have to do that first 3 years before you can do the next thing, right? And then I read something, or I heard somewhere that there was a 5% of courses which was about experience or about other things that could get you in. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, I followed the trail and ended up getting an interview for a master's course thinking, I don't know why this is happening. I had no idea how I was going to pay for it or how I was going to do it.
They're expensive.
They cost a little bit of money. And people often think of like the 30 grand or the 18 grand or whatever.
But it's not, because you're not.
Well, I just thought I need 3 grand to pay for a term.
Okay.
So I chunked it down.
Yeah.
And then I don't know how I'm going to make the next 3 grand, but I'll get 3 grand for the next term. Like if I thought 3 years it was 2 actually. So I think what people do is they look at something that they want to do and they go, well, I'm never going to get in. And here's the trick. I thought that as well. Then they don't send in the application, right? Because they're like, I'm never going to get in. For me, I thought, never going to get in, might as well send the application.
Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. That's my motto. I totally agree with that. A lot of people have a fear of trying things. What if? And it's like, well, but what if it's great?
What if it works?
Yeah, which is incredible. My first job was a grad scheme. And I basically said, your biggest competitor want to hire me. They absolutely didn't. I used to get coffee as an intern. And they tell me, but I'm quite interested in you. And they're like, well, it's a grad scheme. And I was like, look, it's up to you. And I got the job and my friends were like, how are we taking out student loans and getting into debt? And you've just waltzed into a graduate program. I'm like, but you didn't try that.
Right, exactly.
So have fun
How do you know?
studying marketing telecommunications.
Which will all be irrelevant.
Which is so irrelevant. Oh, they all came to me after. How do I write a CV? How do I get an interview? So what made you choose, you said psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. What made you choose that? Was it because you kind of got the sense you are extremely intuitive to your detriment, but you could use it for good?
Not at the time.
Okay.
At the time, I was like, what are my skills? Like, what do I know a little bit of that would allow me to do anything? And I was always interested in people and I knew a little bit about people, but I didn't have this like bird's eye view of like, ooh, I have an edge over other people, therefore I should definitely do this. Not at all. I was like, what jobs exist that I can just be with people and kind of use my strengths? And so that's where I started the counseling when I was still deep in recovery and not in a good place. In fact, the beginning of my counseling program, I was still drinking, and I used to, one day a week, and I would go into the bathroom and like lay on the floor because I was so hungover and messed up. Oh my God. And then I'd like splash my face with water and like go into this program, which is in hindsight ridiculous. But so like people think you need to be healed in order to start your journey. And I think that's what I've learned is like, don't wait to be healed for this like timeline that you have no idea what it even means. Take the small actions now and see where it takes you. And that might just help your healing.
Yeah. And during this time, your support system, what did that look like? Because having people physically present around you doesn't mean that they're a support system, obviously. But was there anyone in particular in your life where you could just phone and say, today's a really bad day, I'm really, really struggling?
So I now realize that my ex-husband's family were a support system, but in a practical way.
Right.
So they couldn't quite be an emotional support, but they could be a practical support for me as a parent. And, on Sunday they would do Sunday lunch and they would bring us as a family together. And, they would be around, in a way. And, his mom would look after my son when I needed to do things. And, so some of my siblings haven't had that, right? So that just some kind of practical support around them. So I'm grateful for that piece. I'm such in the early stage, it was looking on YouTube for like who's done things in the past and what did they do. It was like virtual mentors. And then in AA, you learn that you take a few people's numbers so that when you do have a bad day, specifically connected to alcohol, but to other things as well, you learn to be honest. I'd never learned that. It's a skill, And so to pick up the phone or to begin to build that support network over time. And then over the years, fellow students. But it was always like a piece of the puzzle. And then over time, reconnecting with my siblings or people that were raised like me was a big deal as well. Because we'd now all gone through a bit of and we're like, oh, actually, you're the only people that understand. And we could be proud of each other for wherever we'd gotten to. And
do you have contact with some of your siblings?
Oh, yeah, all of them now.
Okay.
All of them. We're all live in different countries, but we're all very much connected.
That's good. Yeah. And what did learning psychotherapy teach you about what you'd gone through? And was it quite difficult? Were you sometimes in a lecture and you thought, oh, crap, I'm actually one of these people?
Yeah, we teach what we most need to learn, right? And so I remember a very early kind of experience where we had to sit in a circle, and it's about personal development and knowing yourself. It isn't just about how do we help other people, right? And that was a shock to me. So I think there was a question of like, so Petra, tell us who you are and a little bit about your story. Right? I'm like, I work hard to pretend like I just have a kid and I'm just in London. My parents, traveled a lot, and people could sort of fill in the blanks. And I think I burst into tears because I was thinking, like, what are the rules here? Right? I don't know the rules as far as how much I should share or not share. And so that was a learning process of, feeling into it, understanding what was a safe place and what wasn't. What did I even know about my story? And so, over time and then doing my master's was about studying the impact on really young children of their environment. And so, right?
I mean,
and so
those are some home truths.
So I have 2 young kids and I have been an active alcoholic for their younger years, right? Yeah. And then I think about the quiet, shy little child, 1 of 5, who's trying to survive in a commune and parents are off being leaders and doing whatever they're doing. So, I mean, holy shit. Talk about holding a mirror up to, the lesson of that it's not your fault, but that at some point I was perpetuating the cycle of, I want to use the word abuse like really loosely. I don't mean physical or anything like that, but just like trauma cycles, right? Yeah. Continuing. And so I had to learn that, do I continue to blame the past for why that's happening? I could, and it's true. Or do I realize that now it's on me, right? Because now I am responsible for the next generation. And that was a tough truth that meant I needed to do the work.
Well, I think there's a level of, self-blame probably, but, the behaviors after you left aren't your fault. And it's about coming to terms with the fact that this is how you worked your way through it.
But as I think it's Maya Angelou that Oprah quotes a lot, when you know better, you do better, right? And so that's where you can have empathy and compassion for the traumatized kid who doesn't know any better. But I'm studying now, and I'm reading, and I'm learning, and I'm looking, and you have to deal with the guilt of who you've become. And when you know better, you do better.
Yeah. And how did, obviously you've started your business after your master's. Was it straight after your master's?
I worked in youth mental health in the charity sector for quite a number of years. And then I worked in employee well-being as a clinical director for an EAP. So I kind of experienced the world a little bit. Yeah. And then started my business a few years after, yeah.
So talk to me about your business.
So people start businesses for different reasons, right? Either they I was in the shower and I had this great idea, right? Or they've tested things their whole lives, right? For me, I got sick of working in places that were telling other people how to do it right and weren't doing it themselves. I have lived a double life and it nearly killed me. And I was like, there's got to be another way. Like, how am I in a mental health company, right? Teaching other people, do this and training and like blah, blah, blah. And then like just, toxic behaviors and all the things, right? And so I kind of quit my job because I was sick of things. And I'd just gotten divorced.
Oh, God.
So I was now living in a little flat with my kids were 50-50 between me and my ex. And weirdly, now all my bills are on me for the first time in my entire life. The worst time to start a business, right? Or was it? Yeah. Because it was the first time that I didn't have anyone to answer to or consult. Yeah. So I was like, this is the only time. This is the best time to take the risk because I can, not earn and I don't have anyone to explain myself to. That was liberating. So there was definitely a few absolutely terrifying months of like, what's my bank balance looking like?
Oh, God, I bet.
Right?
Yeah.
But even then I didn't have like the perfect narrative for how to build a business or what I wanted to do. I was experimenting. And I use experimenting for me, like for my mental health, for my mindset, for my business, my career, blah, 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 is the best way. Mm-hmm. And, there's all this fancy founder language now about experimenting and
it's quite funny, isn't it?
Iterating.
It's when you read this stuff, you just think, oh, for
I do a little
sake.
bit now. Because I don't even consider myself a founder anymore.
No?
I am, but I'm not on the path of like scale, exit, that language that's a bit culty in itself of like success means this way and fast and then money and I don't know. It's very
exit.
Yeah. Well, when they ask you about an exit when you've not even started or you're barely it's a seed and they're like, so what's your exit strategy?
Honestly, do you know what? But do you know what the best one recently is? Businesses that to have failed suddenly haven't failed. They've been acquired.
Oh, I see.
A successful exit. And you think, no, it wasn't. Which is obviously terrible for anyone's business who doesn't work. I'm more talking about people who clearly ran their businesses really, really badly and weren't the best people.
There's so much going on behind the scenes.
It's the ego, isn't it?
Yeah.
They cannot possibly, there's so much, I give so much credit to people who come out, even on a LinkedIn post and say, we didn't make it, we didn't make enough money, this breaks my heart, this is the situation, because that takes a lot because most of admitting that something's wrong or that something isn't working anymore is about how you think other people are going to think of you and how you think about yourself. So I think it's like a very brave truth to come face to face with.
Well, it's your identity getting looped into the identity of your business or that strategy. And so like when a business fails, you're a failure.
Yes, exactly.
Is how it's experienced.
Yeah.
Rather than, hey, I experimented on that one. The next one's going to be different. Like you take what you've learned. It's not just a complete finish, which is what the industry kind of looks at it as sometimes.
I think if you look at the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, they all have a failed venture beforehand. And it's that resilience. It's that getting up and trying again and again and again and again, even if it takes 10 times. It's being able to be kicked repeatedly and still get back up.
And you have to do it for the journey, not just the destination.
Exactly. And I think that's where a lot of people are slipping up here when they have these exit things in mind. And, oh, imagine if I sell for X amount and this and that. And they just think about the finish line, where it's like, actually, you need to build something that you really believe in, that your employees believe in.
Yeah. And also then what? Like you sell. And if from a mental health perspective, that's often still, even if it's a successful exit, that can still be where a dark time occurs, because we get a bit lost thinking, great, I did that high. Now what? What actually matters to me? What are my values? Do I have any friends around me or partners, or like what else is my life other than this relentless drive?
I always imagine taking a bath in 20-pound notes or getting on a private jet with all my friends. But you're right, it could be dark. I'm not going to say no to.
I'm down with that bath. Let's make it happen.
Do you know what you could do? I've seen you could do like, I'm a property investor now. I bought a few houses. I'm a property investor, so you always have a job.
But that's if you can navigate that transition easily or feel like that identity matches the one that you had before. Because often the people you worked with to get to that point, everyone's disappeared now. Yeah. You don't have the shared connection, belonging, and mission. And so it's those bits that can feel so intrinsic. Great, you have money, but the science is that we're not any happier after 75K.
Well, that might be the UK tax system.
It might be.
That could be the problem.
It might be.
But maybe like 75 million could be the happy spot.
Well, they say that you're not happier statistically.
Do you know what I always say? Money can't make you happy, but having money problems can make you terribly sad.
Right, which is why I think the evidence is that having 75,000 is that point where your basic needs are met and where you can do the things broadly that you want to do, not living in London.
Except owning a house in London. Yeah. Good luck with that.
Yeah. But anyway, I guess it brings it back to what is the intrinsic worth of your life and what actually matters to you. And, it's usually connection, belonging, kind of joy, like feeling like your values are aligned, like these different things. Yes, money's great. But if we don't have some of those core things, and if all of our because look at some founders are like bloody 18, right? Or younger, right? Who are on this path.
It's disgusting.
So where do you find your purpose and your self-worth, right? It's all connected to that cycle. And so if that goes, then what, right? So I'm like, we need to build our intrinsic sense of self-worth on these journeys as well.
And how does your business work? So if I come to you and I say, right, I need your services, what does that look like?
Yeah, so there's two pieces. One is, I guess, the bit that I do, so the personal brand element, right? Mm-hmm. So I've got a book out. I'm writing a second one.
Amazing.
I'm a keynote speaker. I do things like this and kind of share the message of what we do. And then my team essentially work with companies and organizations thinking about their culture. So we're a mental health consultancy, and the way that we help businesses is thinking about culture, because it's prevention, right? Rather than and educating them educating them sometimes for the first time that mental health isn't all about, are you okay? Are you depressed? Are you anxious?
Here's a Headspace app.
Well, there we go. Well, and also what's really culty these days is, people are burnt out and like all these things are happening, and it's suddenly like, it's a you problem. So they're like, you should have better boundaries or go to sleep on time or do these things. And so all the well-being stuff is like little tips for you and not taking into account the system, right? From technology to working practices to meeting culture to all the things that actually are pushing people, you know? So we talk about a mentally healthy organization has individual responsibility plus organizational. And so when you have both of those together, that's when things can go better. So I guess our job is to call out the tick boxes and through training, through strategy work and supporting organizations to create those mentally healthy cultures.
Is there, obviously you come in and you know, you observe things. Are there sometimes some quite difficult bits of news or wake-up calls to deliver to those companies?
Well, that's not our job, but I mean, I guess as far as the whole thing, but yes, as whoever we're working with, I guess our job is to call out the system. And so they might, and also that, you know, we'll have companies who are laying off 20% of their workforce, usually in ways that are not always the best, right? And I get it. Sometimes you got to lay people off, right? But there's how you do it, right?
Not on a group Zoom call with 70 of them.
Please don't.
At once, yeah.
And then they might call us in and say, can you do a resilience workshop to just make people like buck up through this tough, unsafe, horrific
so
time.
Dealing with the repercussions after this.
Yeah.
Okay. That's actually really interesting though, and I think really useful because the amount of places that I've worked in the past where, you know, there has been some cuts and now, I mean, in the last couple of years, they've been aggressive cuts. Some people have lost over 50% of their workforce. What is the morale like to the people left behind? And often it's actually quite bad.
And they usually have double the work because the resource, you know, the work still needs to be done.
Yeah.
And so there's this notion that, well, you're lucky to still have a job, so work harder. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And the problem I have with resilience is as a tool is often it's like, well, you're not resilient enough. When actually, if we've been through a pandemic, if you've been through job changes, restructures, like the whole list of things going on, you're already resilient. Right? Yeah. People think if their physical or mental health is struggling, I must not be resilient enough. And you probably went through more things than other people, right? And so you've been more resilient, but you're hitting those cracks along the way. So anyway, we educate people that, you know, boosting resilience is a little bit patronizing sometimes. And actually we want to provide different skills, which could boost your resilience, but it's about like, how are you presenting that as an issue?
Okay. Right? So, and like really working with the team to deliver something that's actually going to give them a decent
communication
experience.
Vulnerability, like psychological safety, like how do we build the building blocks to get this right?
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Do you know what's interesting? The word cult.
Did you notice that?
Just now.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it?
Honestly, though.
And there is a whole subset of people who are like, but couldn't some cults be good? And like, so yeah, seriously, I get this a lot. And I'm like, I think the premise of the word cult is that like a leader is like, or you know, the founder, whatever, is abusing their power in some way, right? But yes, culture is where we have collective responsibility, right? Where we have systems that we can call out, you know, inappropriate behavior, where we have checks and balances, and we create something where people feel a sense of belonging and shared purpose. I'm not against those things. I do that with my team, right? But anyone can challenge anyone at any time, right? That's the difference.
Yeah, I think I mean, it'd be interesting to get your take on this. My first recruitment job was in a very high-performing, successful company. I was one of 4 women, 200 men. And it was very like...
Fun.
I went into a place where I became very, very alpha and aggressive, and that was cheered on. And even the not so good practices were cheered on, like phoning up a client and saying, oh, you shouldn't use this other agency because they said this about you. Ooh. Like that's what was taught. But I remember specifically we were in a meeting with the CEO and he honestly, at the time, I thought, this guy's a great CEO. Like, he really knows how to lead people. They're all just like hanging off every word that he says. And people used to like, oh, I bleed what the company color was. I don't want to give it away. But I bleed this color.
Yeah.
And I used to be like, yeah. And I spent 18 months there, and people were just so, you were just conditioned to think that was the best. And if you failed there, your life was a failure. And then
I was something wrong with you. Probably.
I was eventually sacked after 18 months. Totally not my fault, but and I felt like I had lost my entire identity, which is nuts. It's a job, but I felt like my career is over. I have nothing. Anywhere else I go is second rate. I've blown my only chance, which is absolutely rubbish, because how many tech recruiters are there out there? But I was so, and I just remember I collected up all my stuff, and I had a bad habit of collecting high heels underneath my desk so that when I went to meetings, but obviously I needed the right colors. So I'd accumulated like a solid 10 pairs of stilettos. And I remember I'm holding them all, and they're like, you can come and get your stuff another time, which I know not to be true because you're locked out of all the systems, you're enemy number one. And I just remember falling down the stairs and like every shoe clattering around me, and then crying my eyes out and thinking, I'm 21 and my life's already over because I just blew the biggest chance I've ever had. Yes. And then subsequently I interviewed at what was perceived to be the other top 3 agencies. And my ex-employer had called ahead and said, she's trouble. Don't take her, which is obviously really illegal now. But we were taught that the CEO was really scary. He had heavies. You didn't take them to court. Like, you didn't mess with them, which I think is really interesting from a company perspective. How do you drill in? I mean, you've got a bunch of young people who are earning more money than they've ever seen in their entire lives. You've been conditioned to be a certain way. And I just think people talk about cults and living in these communes, and obviously what you've been through is totally different. But then you can get that in the form of a company, and then you feel like you've lost a limb when you don't have them anymore. And that's such an unhealthy culture to build people to give their whole existence to you and let that define them. Have you seen a change since there are more legals in place? Or do you still see those toxic cultures where people are really indoctrinated and you think they're not going to do well when they leave?
There's definitely plenty of those toxic cultures. And, just think of the kind of, again, we're trying not to name companies, but the ones that consider employees like family, and this kind of narrative of like,
I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you. That we're all in this together, and this is, you're changing the world. It's the very same language, right? You're changing the world. You're part of something greater than you, right? So it feels like, oh, I feel so lucky. I feel part of something. And then, let's make being in the workplace, and of course now we've got the hybrid world, but as attractive as possible, and as much peer pressure as possible to stay late, and to have the gym on site, and to, like eat your healthy food, or the free benefits, like benefits to just keep you there, right?
Here's a crash.
Right. Let's just have all the things. Live here. You know?
Beds.
Yeah. And, I love a shared mission and a shared goal. But I guess the tips I would give people are, is that mission aligned with who you are and your values? It's just a good question. What are your values? What does matter to you, right? Because then you can kind of ethically decide if it's a fit. Keep yourself grounded. And what I mean by that is having a couple friends or people, and you probably have them, but you ignore them, that are outside of your cult corporate, right? Who can kind of right size you around, relationships, connections. Like, you'll be hearing what the problem is long before the full on firing crash point, right? So where are you investing your time to build your whole life, not just your work life? Right. And that could mean a passion project. It could mean, boosting relationships, whatever. Like, there's been times in my life where a lot of my life was work or study. And so I'm not here for this like perfect work-life balance means you clock off at 5 no matter where you work. No, you might have a phase of your life where you are building and you are doing something that matters. Great. But you got to sense check, and you've got to know if this is your life that you're leading or someone else's. those are the kind of checks and balances, I guess, I would encourage.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And what advice could you give to, well, there's two sets of advice. I'm going to start with the first one. What advice would you give to a founder who is going through extremely rapid growth? Because we now know the way that the investment world works. You can literally have 10 people in a room, raise 60 million, and that's soon got to be 200. So you've kind of got to speedily build this team. What's your advice to someone who really wants to keep it healthy, but also really wants people to be bought in?
Yeah, everyone's different, first of all. And like I said, different phases of life, you'll need different things. But you might just want a weekly, a monthly coach or a therapist or someone, because the first step is always knowing yourself. And if you're 19, 20, like on this track, you may very well find out, and we've seen this countless times, that, where however the business goes, success or not success, right? There's this kind of looking around, catching your breath and going, who are my people? Or what's my physical health like? Because I've been in a basement eating pizza for months, right? And that's fine when you're 20, but not when you're 30 or 40. I don't know,
it doesn't sound terrible.
It's the short-term dopamine goodness for like long-term pain, right?
It's the introverted extrovert in me that sounds divine.
Yeah, within reason.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with pizza or ice cream or anything, but, it's like, so physical health, connection and with humans, actual humans, not just like this little world, right? And your mental health. So checking your mindset, who am I? It's just those three components, and you can do the 5-minute versions or you can do the longer versions. And depending on where you're at in life, that can change. But keeping them as a priority is essential, because otherwise, like many of us, we don't realize it's happening until we hit our crash point.
It sounds like the onus is not just on the big boss. The onus is on yourself as an individual as well, to be able to check your situation, check
I'd
your
like
reality.
all the onus to be on the big boss, but the reality is that unless you can think for yourself, you won't be able to challenge when it's going the wrong way. And in the founder world, startup world, I want to see investors thinking about, how do we nurture our prime talent to actually be well through this process. And I know there's some that are popping up to think about that, getting coaching or kind of support that isn't just financial support and like, this is how you invest, and tactical business support, but leadership support, well-being support, those sorts of things. So I think the onus is always on both, but you are you. So like, we can wait for other people, or we can go, what's the life that I want to live? And am I willing to challenge the system where necessary? Yeah,
I know, absolutely. And what advice, this isn't an easy one because it's hard to sum up a piece of advice in this situation. But maybe imagine you in this situation and what maybe you would have wanted to hear. But for anyone who feels quite weighed down by their trauma and potentially feel like they couldn't succeed because they are in such a thick smog of whatever it be, grief, trauma, sadness, how can you turn your trauma into something positive? And what would you tell them to do?
So my first podcast was called Adversity to Advantage because I wanted to explore that exact topic. So firstly, your trauma can be your superpower. And that means you can work harder than anyone because you've got that kind of demon behind you, right? And while that sounds like a terrible thing, it's actually brilliant at times, right? But what gets you to one point is not the same thing that's going to get you to the next point. So that fuel can get you to a certain point. But eventually, you're going to need to learn how to let go, accept, process, heal, whatever language you want to use, right? Because if you don't, it will start to affect your relationships. And I don't just mean romantic, I mean with your co-founder, with your siblings, with your parents, with your network of people. That's where it sort of generally shows up. So the second phase is kind of work on yourself. Now that could mean lots of things. It could be reading books, listening to podcasts, listening to mentors, like applying it to your own life. but know that you don't need to, we said this before, but you don't need to wait to be healed in order to take action. So take, messy experimental action on your life while in parallel learning about yourself, having places to kind of discuss, whether it's friends or, I've always had people who I could say, I did this thing, but I really messed up. And they weren't the kind of cheerleader or the, yeah, you suck person, but the kind of, oh, I wonder why you felt that way. Where do you think that was coming from? Oh, did your parents model this kind of behavior? Just having that ability to be self-aware. And that's like, yourself. Yeah. And if you don't, get started.
That's very sound advice. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It was a ride.
It was a lot.
No, it was a lot, but I think it's inspiring, and I think it's really important that people can truly see that you really can feel like you're at rock bottom, and if you persevere and do the work, that you can find your way out the tunnel. You have to go.
Build a great life.
You have to go through it to get over it. So
the only way is through.
The only way is through.
And that's okay. Let's get honest about it as well.
Love that.
Thank you.